Welcome to the Decision Lab podcast, the sanctuary for wellness professionals like therapists, coaches, creators, and more who are looking to over-deliver to their clients.
We uncover the truth behind cutting-edge wellness products by going straight to the founder.
We use our backgrounds in neuroscience, chemical engineering, and marketing to ask the hard questions in order to eliminate bias, misinformation, and fancy marketing language.
Allowing you to make better wellness decisions and recommendations for yourself and your clients.
So if you're a leader in the health and wellness space, welcome. This podcast was designed for you.
Join us every week for interviews that will change how you think about wellness.
Welcome back to the Decision Lab. Pumped to have Stefan here. He's the co-founder and scientific officer of Sensate. So pumped to get to know you. I'm really excited for this conversation. I've used Sensate myself. So let's move into our origin story section. Tell us a little bit about your origin story. What's your background? How'd you get here?
Well, so I was bitten by a radioactive spider when I was, no, I wasn't really. I guess I kind of was brought up in what at the time was quite an unusual way. So I was brought up meditating by my dad, who taught me and my brother to meditate when I was very young, 5 or 6 or something. So that's kind of always been part of my life. The idea that people can use their own body to self-regulate the breathing and their own attention to self-regulate. And we were brought up with things that are now commonplace but weren't at the time, like natural foods, etc. And I did a number of things, but it became apparent that I wanted to move into what at the time was referred to as alternative medicine. It's now really referred to much more as complementary or integrated healthcare. So I spent about 13 years training in Chinese medicine in particular, so acupuncture and herbal medicine and all the aspects of that. And then I founded a company called New Medicine Group in Harley Street, which is London's main medical street, private medical street. And that was a group of doctors and professors who all sort of shared different skills, but all shared a kind of interest and passion for wondering what it is why some people get better from anything and why some people don't get better from anything. What is it that determines that? And so we spent about a 15-year journey really examining that. We worked as a team and we had an professor of integrated healthcare, various doctors running functional medicine, homeopaths, art therapists, which is a regulated profession in the UK, body workers, physiotherapists. And we specialized in kind of problems that weren't terribly well treated with a mainstream medical approach. And we would either work individually or as a team in an integrated fashion on these particular cases. And my passion and interest has always really been for the psychological and the emotional aspects of somebody's health. So I've always tended to specialize in anxiety and depression and insomnia and on happiness, because it's always seemed to me, in my experience over the last 35 years since I've been practicing, has really only made that more clear, that how we feel really determines how our health is.
For sure.
Yeah. So one of the questions I've been asking patients in my induction for decades is called the Subjective Wellbeing Questionnaire, which is a very, very simple, incredibly well-validated piece of research where you basically just ask somebody, what's your subjective feeling of well-being right now in this moment on a scale from X to Y? And how people answer that question is an astonishingly accurate predictor of their long-term health, their well-being, and actually their longevity. So you get people who have medically very little wrong with them, but as far as they're concerned, their symptoms are catastrophic, and they say, well, my health is really bad. And then you get people who are dying, who say, well, actually, my health is pretty good. I don't mind. It's okay. And I've been told by a doctor that I've got 6 months to live. And I've taken that approach into what we now do with the company, with Sensate, that what people tell us and how they feel is really as important as anything else that we can measure. So I'd been using sound-based technology in the clinic for many years, and that became like a sort of staple part, really, of something that we did with all our chronically ill patients, which is what we tended to see. Working with sound and relaxation and breathing and meditation really is a kind of baseline, because unless that's well regulated, unless somebody's ability to manage stress and to breathe properly is well regulated, then pretty much nothing else works terribly well. Even if treatments do work, they don't tend to stick. So, we regarded that as a baseline, essential component for pretty much any health or well-being. So I would see a lot of people, I would teach them to meditate, I would teach them to relax, I would teach them to breathe. And I would use sound technology with them, which I developed over a number of years. I started off decades ago just putting speakers under pillows while somebody was lying there, and that worked really well. And then attaching speakers to the couch while they were lying there. And then eventually bringing over, we were the first people to use a system. We came across it in a very upmarket clinic that we were consulting for in Switzerland. A system that was like a kind of zero gravity bed with 4 huge speakers in it, and you wore headphones, and it took you through this audio and vibrotactile program. And during meditation one day, while using that system, I had this, eureka realization that actually this was brilliant, and the clinical results were great, but actually accessibility for this was pretty poor. Somebody had to pay a lot of money, come and see a specialist, go into a big clinic, and surely there was a way to miniaturize this and make it much more available as a consumer product, which is where the kind of blueprint for the concept arrived and the patent and everything flowed from there.
Got it.
So my personal journey to well-being has been via parental upbringing and my obsession really with sound and with nature. I have only become more convinced over the years that it's our broken relationship with nature that's the cause, the root of so many of the chronic problems we have. And so that's why we incorporate a lot of biophilia into the music we create. So this is O.M. Wilson, the biophilia hypothesis. The idea that using the sounds, sights, and smells of nature talk directly to a deep cellular genetic part of us and have the capacity to heal trauma, anxiety, and chronic illness, inflammation, right the way through. And this is really being supported by research that's coming out of Japan, for instance, with forest bathing. Finland's been really doing a lot of research into this. So I think there's massive support now for the importance of access to nature. But it's not easy for everyone to get into nature. So what I've created is a system that allows people to have a nature biophilia experience without necessarily going and spending a week in Alaska.
Got it. And we'll get into some more of that here in a second. I'd love to understand a little bit more about you personally too. So you've done a lot of work with trauma, anxiety, depression, it sounds like. What's your research background? Do you have a PhD, an MD, licensing? Like, what does that kind of stuff look like?
Yes, I've got a Master's of Science degree, which is, a degree obviously, and then a Master's of Science degree, which was actually in toxicology. And I was looking at the liver enzymes involved in taking certain common herbal medicines to see whether there was an issue that isn't particularly, it turns out, which is great. But, that gave me a somewhat research orientated mind view and mindset. And we do distinguish actually between science and research in the company. One of the things I like to kind of point out is that I think the scientific model has gone a bit off track.
Interesting.
Yeah? In as much as, one of the few magazines I subscribe to every week is New Scientist. I'm an avid science and anthropological research consumer. But I think we've lost track of the person in the search for data. And so you tend to get clinicians and you tend to get researchers. Sometimes you get both. But my experience is that researchers don't really understand human motivation. And clinicians aren't necessarily very good at acquiring data in the way that a researcher would approve of. These two worlds don't mix as well as they should for the benefit of the patient, which is really the incentive behind forming New Medicine Group. What I was seeing was a lot of patients who were being told one thing by their consultant or doctor, another thing by their alternative medicine therapist, and they weren't qualified to decide whose advice to follow. So they weren't being served by their healthcare practitioners. So the whole idea of integrated healthcare and what we were doing there was to provide a balanced view of what actually works.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I like that perspective. I think I would agree with that. We'll get more into that in our lab section, I'm sure. I'd love to understand kind of a wild question, if I knew you in middle school, would I have known that you'd be here today?
That's a great question. So I'm fairly neurodiverse, which is a quality that I've recognized and embraced in myself in the last few years. My oldest son is neurodiverse. I can now see that my dad and my brother are neurodiverse. And these weren't terms, of course, that were understood or even talked about a few decades ago. I can now see with my experience that my dad in particular was basically suffering from undiagnosed PTSD, which people who are neurodiverse are more likely to experience because society isn't really set up for people who see the world differently. So I don't know whether most people, when I was at school, weren't aware of these subtleties, right? It is interesting to note, though, that most of the people that we would tend to regard as geniuses who came up with great inventions, and I'm not including myself in that, we would now call neurodiverse. So Mozart and Beethoven and Musk and Einstein, Da Vinci, all these people fit the box absolutely for neurodiversity. So what that means is you see the world in a different way. I mean, it would be a bit of a nightmare if everybody was like that.
It would. I'm curious, like, what is a way that someone who is neurodiverse might see the world differently than someone who isn't, in your experience?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and very hard to answer, because how do you explain how you see the world to somebody that doesn't see it like that?
Fair.
So it reminds me a little bit of the story about the frog that goes back to the pond and meets his old tadpole mates and tries to explain the concept of dry to them. How do you explain dry to a tadpole? You can't, right? You can only understand that which you have direct experience of. Yeah. So, and because everything is subjective, unless you've experienced something, you can't really understand it. And I think that's the role of art and poetry and music, is to try and convey concepts which are about feelings and subjectivity, which don't lend themselves well to linear word descriptions. So maybe that's the answer to your question, thinking about it. I think somebody, depending on the type of neurodiversity they have, they see things in much more less linear fashion. So things are much more about shapes and pictures and connections and metaphor and story than they are purely number-driven directives.
Got it. Yeah, I love that. That's interesting. So back to the middle school question, you'd mentioned the neurodiversity. If I knew you in middle school, do you think I would have known you'd get here based on your experience?
Maybe you would have realized that I wouldn't have followed a conventional career path. Whether I'd have ended up in health and technology, who knows? If that's the thought that you might have had, you probably would have assumed that I was going to end up in prison or something like that, because I was pretty unconventional and I didn't follow the rules. I still have a problem with that now. But that's also your superpower, right? As somebody who's neurodiverse, and I think the trick is for companies and people in society to work out how to use those superpowers for good, right? Because until relatively recently, and my children laugh at me when I say that, because when I say relatively recently, I'm sometimes talking about, the Roman Empire. But until relatively recently, say the Industrial Age, which it really is quite relatively recently, there would have been positions and roles and stations in society and in village life for people who thought differently. They would have been the priests or the druids or the magicians or the blacksmith or the jewelry worker or whatever. They would have had positions where they wouldn't have been outside of society. And I think we're coming full circle now. So I think companies like Google, for instance, they specifically hire people with neurodiverse traits because they know that actually these people produce out-of-the-box ideas which are innovative and which challenge the norm. And of course, big companies desperately need that.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
They're doing it for commercial purpose, but I think the value and the superpower of the neurodiverse is being recognized more and more. And I've worked a little bit with a company called Neurodiverse Sport. So amongst elite athletes, neurodiversity is very disproportionately represented. And in a lot of fields of endeavor so probably not in banking and accountancy, but in a lot of fields of endeavor where some kind of innovative or out-of-the-box thinking is helpful, or an attitude is helpful, you'll find neurodiverse people disproportionately represented.
How would you define neurodiversity?
Well, it's the term we use now. It's been called various things over the years, from madness through to... we talked about Asperger's syndrome and autistic spectrum and being on the spectrum. So, those terms don't tend to get used anymore. So everything just gets lumped under the term neurodiversity, which is good in terms of destigmatizing it, but not terribly useful in terms of perhaps determining what somebody needs and where their strengths are. So, you get people, if I use the old term autistic, who are non-verbal, who can't talk and actually probably can't really function. the kind of Rain Man syndrome, but, they can remember what day it was, 50 years ago or whatever, what day of the week it was. So, their skill set is incredibly niche and very hard for a normal society to work with. And then you get people like, say, Musk, who has a very socially acceptable neurodiversity because he has worked out how to channel that into corporate endeavor. So you have these two kind of extreme ends of the spectrum. And as I say, I think companies and society is getting better at understanding how to deal with that, which is great. Because in many ways, people that think differently, and I think that proportion is increasing, actually, in response to probably evolutionary need. And in many ways, it's these people who present the potential solutions to what the planet needs.
Yeah. I like that. Is there a
we
problem
don't
challenge?
Need more the same. We need different thinking.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. Is there a problem or challenge you've overcome as someone who's neurodiverse that's kind of shaped who you are today?
Well, I've never tended to. I haven't followed at all a remotely traditional career path. I've always done my own thing, and that's been essential. But also, there's cost associated with that. It's harder for me to communicate with people, either individually or in groups, because it's harder for me and people like me to convey the message I'm trying to convey. And to not be misunderstood. I'm sitting here today talking to you in what is hopefully a relatively normal fashion because of years and decades of experience and self-evaluation. So I can function very well. The trick is to try to not have that creative, innovative part of me suppressed so that I can function more easily. And I think this is really the need for anyone who has a creative streak is, okay, how do you remain creative? How do you stoke your superpower without having to live on the fringe of society?
That is a very, very good question. How does someone who is neurodiverse use their superpower but not live on the fringe of society?
So I think, again, we come back to nature, I think. Nature has a unique way to keep us in balance and harmony and to highlight what's important and what isn't, and gives you the ability to understand that leading a simpler life is possible, and also a lot of the things that you thought were really important actually aren't, because they're not going to make you happy. So one of the things I talk about, one of the things I've been looking into and researching even more recently, is the concept of comfort and the idea that comfort is killing us.
Comfort is killing us.
So comfort's really a very relatively new thing. Even your grandparents would have been astonished at the level of comfort that most people now live in. Medieval kings wouldn't even have dreamed of the level of comfort the average person lives in. The availability of heat and light and food. And it's only a few generations ago that access to calories would have been, and heat would have been life or death. So, of course, the issue is that technological change has outstripped evolutionary change. So since the Industrial Revolution a few hundred years, 200-300 years ago, and now the digital revolution, which we're still living through, you have exponential technological change, and we can't possibly keep up with that. So it takes hundreds, even thousands of years for meaningful genetic change to happen. So our core autonomic nervous system, which is what I'm interested in and obsessed by, is still telling us, oh, there's sugar, you need to eat it, because it might fall off the trees in a week, and it might, it'll be winter soon. So eat that sugar because you don't know when the next meal is coming. So our primitive primeval messages are completely out of whack with how we're doing. We're afraid of getting cold, because there was a time when that meant death. So now we have the heating up too high. We love comfortable beds and comfortable cars because those were such a luxury or completely unavailable. So the problem with comfort is there's no such thing as too much comfort. And it never makes you happy, because when you achieve the level of comfort that you thought you wanted, you just want a higher level of comfort.
Right. So
it's a bit like the model that a lot of games and smart device games use, where you're never satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
You're always driven. You do hours of work and you get that thing, that virtual good. Great, amazing. But you don't then quit and you're not happy because there's another one, there's a bigger one. So then you have to do exactly the same thing for that next good. And our lives are very much like that, right? You get that promotion, but then there's somebody above you and you get that car, but hey, there's a bigger car or a newer car, or you get that house. But actually, I want, I want a whole swimming pool now. So we're seeking the hedonic treadmill. We're seeking happiness through acquisition of things and status has never in the, let's call it 350,000 year history of mankind, made people happy.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. I couldn't agree more. There's a lot of research around this too, like Dopamine Nation, like the Yale Happiness research that Dr. Laurie Santos does. So it's interesting. I like that. Let's move from.
This is not controversial. This is basic neurology and anthropology.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm here for it. I did a lot of that research during COVID too. So I would love to move into kind of your claim to fame and into our claim to fame section here a little bit. And the first question we love to ask people, is tell us what Sensate is and why we should care in 60 seconds.
So I determined that one of the biggest problems the world has is people feeling anxious and fearful and uncomfortable because they can't self-regulate. And whereas there are plenty of ways that you can do that, they require huge amounts of investment in time and skill and energy. And because we're so anxious and overwhelmed, we're not going to do those things. So I invented a technology that did that for you. And I had a real, I struggled with that. I'm trained in a tradition which really accentuates the need to work hard over a period of time and do your hours every day, learning how to relax and meditate, and in 20 years' time, you become proficient. But, if I said to most people, look, do this for an hour every day for 10 years and you'll feel better at the end of it, I'm not going to have many people listening to me. But, that's so the techniques which we know beyond doubt work. Again, there's huge amounts of research about meditation, about breathing. There's zero doubt that they're effective. And the problem is nobody almost is going to do an hour a day for 10 years, which actually is what you kind of need to do to get to the level of proficiency where you can self-regulate it. So I kind of struggled. I thought, well, do I want to create a shortcut? That really feels like it's devaluing what I was taught and the tradition I grew up with, or didn't grow up with actually, but acquired. But then I realized, okay, well, if I don't, all you've got is hundreds of millions of people being frustrated, overwhelmed, stressed, and unhappy, who aren't going to do the things they could do, in theory, to get themselves out of that. So the idea of Sensate, it's not a replacement for meditation. But my experience is that by showing somebody what it might feel like to feel different, then they become interested. Because that's the thing, right? So many people are just so used to a baseline level of stress and anxiety and overwhelm that they don't even know that's what they're feeling. So many people are used to basically not sleeping. It's one of the biggest problems, that we see today, chronic pain, chronic insomnia. So many people are used to that they think it's normal. And then you give them this insight in a 10-minute Sensate session with what it actually feels like to be not wired. And they go, oh, it literally opens up a whole new world for them. And then they have the enthusiasm. And because it's fun and interesting and enjoyable to do a Sensate session, it's not hard to get people to do more. So it's very different from saying, okay, you've got to go to the gym for an hour every day and do this thing you hate. And again, in 3 months or a month's time, you're going to feel different, which is why gym membership peaks in January and then nobody goes, right? Because, and although everybody's clear what the benefits are, most people just aren't in a position to do the work. So, and I'm really sympathetic towards that. I don't think the world is in a place where being purist is useful. What we need to see the kind of change that's necessary in the world is a tipping point number of people who are able to get out of their immediate anxiety and look forward into the future. And a tipping point, by the way, doesn't have to be a majority. A relatively small number of people can form what becomes a tipping point. So, the ambition that we're edging towards is to have 100 million people benefiting from Sensate sessions in the next year or two. And then that starts to become, and then, if you're a better person, if you're less stressed, if you're less anxious, you then have an impact on all the people around you. You know, you're a better partner, you're a better parent, you're a better work colleague, and those people then start, their lives start to, So that's how you have a kind of a resonating effect. It's like being a nicer, kinder, better person yourself. Obviously, you help yourself, but actually, you become this beacon of influence on the people around you. And people become curious, people's lives improve, but they become curious as to what you've done to achieve this.
So that's a lot of why they should care. Could you tell a little bit of what Sensate specifically is? And then also why create Sensate instead of use something that already existed? There are other products like Sensate, possibly. Why would you create something completely new as opposed to use those products?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of sound-based technology. Sensate is a hardware and sound-based, so you use it with an app. It's this pebble-shaped device. It's kind of ergonomically designed to sit on the chest. And we compose what I call soundscapes. So I go into nature. I go on retreats and I'll sit with nature in various situations, from forests to hills to caves to seasides. And I'll kind of wait for inspiration and motivations and intentions for the soundscapes to arrive, and I'll hum or create some of the rhythms, etc. And then I'll come back and I work with some music artists and we record the stuff. What we call the soundscapes, which you access on the app, are full spectrum pieces. So of course there's an audio component that you hear on headphones, and that's recorded using a whole bunch of secret sauce that we use in neuroacoustic, binaural, but not what most people understand by binaural 3D sound. And then that's synchronized with the way that the pebble resonates on the chest. So the way to think about it is a Sensate soundscape is a bit like an orchestra, and so you can hear most of it, but actually what gives it meaning and depth is the stuff that you don't really look at, the oboe player and the tuba and the bass player, the low stuff. Imagine if you had a band or an orchestra where you stripped out everything below 40 hertz. It would feel really thin. And that's what happens when you listen to music. Yeah, because obviously perception of low frequencies is very limited via the oral experience, which is why we love live music. Because this is a full spectrum sound, and the pattern that we have is based around using infrasound on the chest conveyed via bone conduction into the thorax. So that's the kind of the secret, really, and what's protected by patent is until we came, and it is unique, nobody else is doing this. So until we came along, the only use of bone conduction was for headsets. So things like bike messengers and the special forces troops, people that need to be able to hear, but also need to have music or messages or whatever relayed in. So you put bone conduction headset on above the ears, and you can hear what you're being told, but you can also hear what's going on around you. And so we're the first people to use bone conduction other than on the head. Because actually infrasound doesn't feel very nice on the head, but it feels great on the body. And my clinical experience really showed me, based on what I was saying right at the beginning, that it's what we feel that determines how we are. It's I mean that in terms of emotions, but I also mean that literally. It's literally what we feel that determines how well we feel. So, which is why touch is so important. It's why babies need to be carried and touched. It's why we sing. It's why we chant. It's why we It's why we love being in groups and and making noise with our chest to make our chest resonate. So the anatomical and the mechanical experience and the effects it produces are very similar in some ways to a sound bath. People report it as being very similar to that, or to complex chanting that some people do. But those require quite a high degree of skill to do yourself. Yeah, and also they're very active. They're not. The whole idea about the Sensate technology is it's passive. You don't need to do anything. You just put it on, you close your eyes, you put your headphones on, you click go. And it's that passive part that's really important, because so much of our day-to-day moment by moment experience is asking us to do something, to achieve something, to produce more, to respond. And so our poor nervous systems, our autonomic nervous system in particular, is exhausted. It just wants to switch off and have a pause for 10 minutes, which is what we do. So we're much less interested in data collection. Yeah, so most wearable technology is basically collecting data, and then it tells you how badly you're doing and says, yeah, you're doing really badly and you need to do this. You need to sleep more. Great. Your sleep's really bad and you need to sleep more, or your heart rate variability is really bad and you need to improve it. But what we know from research is that data doesn't change behavior.
Right.
The only thing that changes behavior is how people feel. And if data changed behavior, nobody in the world would smoke and everybody would have a pension. But because that's not how it works, right? And because those things, that the data associated with those and many other similar things doesn't change how we feel. And we have, most people don't know this, we have at least 21 senses. Yeah, people tend to think of the 5, but most of the senses are below the neck. They're in the body. Neuroception, interoception, proprioception. So most of our experience of the world and ourselves, our internal world, isn't from the brain. I mean, of course, the brain is massively important. It's famously the most complicated machine in the galaxy, as far as we know. But we aren't a brain in a jar. So the whole idea of, freezing people's brains and sending them to Mars or freezing them until we invent a cure for something is pretty silly, in my opinion, because so much of what we are and who we are and where our consciousness resides isn't in the brain. And this is famously what they call the hard problem in neuroscience, right? Is what is and where is the consciousness? And I think clearly it isn't just the brain. A lot of it, which is why most of the 21 senses are in the body, not the brain, are in the body. And this is well understood in trauma, for instance, a famous book called The Body Keeps the Score. And if you work, as we have done with trauma patients, you find that it's not the neural processing. There are neural correlates, etc., that you can measure and you can see and you can even try and change. Unless somebody works with their own body in a situation like that, through various techniques, they can get a better understanding of what's going on, but they don't get any better. And I would say that there's not much point understanding your illness, but feeling just as bad. Yeah, that isn't actually what people want.
Cognitively processing it doesn't help heal the same. My degree is in cognitive behavioral neuroscience, and I would argue, and I do with people in relation to the body keeps the score, that the body does not, the brain keeps the score, the body is the scoreboard, is the way that I would kind of think about it. And a lot of the body keeping the score concept is really peripheral nervous system. And would you not agree that that is still your nervous system? Your vagus nerve is a cranial nerve, right? That's the main shoot of your parasympathetic. So that side of your autonomic nervous system is directly like innervates your brain. So that's some of my thoughts.
That's a really nice way of putting it. I mean, the brain's amazing. I'm not in any way denigrating the brain, right? I mean, we've had a vagus nerve for 800 million years-ish. We've had what you might call a human brain for maybe 1 million years. So the responses and the neurobiology around the body sensing things is infinitely more hardwired than the sensory information from the brain. So, as you know, there's more than one brain, right? So, and the vagus nerve starts in the brainstem, 10th cranial nerve, goes down through the body, actually goes all the way to the pelvis. You won't tend to see that in the anatomy books, but it does actually innervate the pelvis, and there are afferent and frontal branches, and there's various branches of the vagus nerve. And if you look up vagus nerve in a neurobiology textbook, you'll get quite a small passage about it, just controlling the heartbeat and controlling digestion. And until quite recently, they did a vagotomy. It was a recognized procedure where you would cut the vagus nerve for people who were having reflux, But I think in the last few years, the understanding of the importance of the vagus nerve, and there is this tendency to isolate the vagus nerve, which is, I see the logic behind that, but of course it is part of the system. It's part of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and then it's part of the whole nervous system, and that's part of the body. And we're part of the world. Yeah. Right. So where one thing ends and something else begins is an interesting question.
And it's also connected to the immune system, the endocrine system. Like there's all the psychoneuroimmunology that it's Absolutely. Not just like one individual system as well. It's so infinitely complex. It's hard to comprehend at times, I feel like.
And Dacher Keltner, professor at Stanford or Harvard, I think at Stanford, specializes particularly in understanding the vagus nerve, and also his other interest is in awe, AWE. And, he's very convincing when he talks about peak experience and flow states and awe, daily awe and big awe experiences really being what activate what he calls the nerve of compassion, the nerve of empathy, the vagus nerve. So I think, so we talk about, and what Sensate is designed to do is increase vagal nerve tone. Because, I mentioned New Medicine Group and our obsession with, why do some people get better and some people not? And what for a long time, we thought it was heart rate variability. And then we realized what drives heart rate variability is vagal tone. And so, as close to the source of regulation as you can get is vagal tone. You could have an interesting discussion about, okay, what determines, what's behind that. But vagal tone drives everything we're interested in. It drives blood pressure, heart rate variability, gut motility, sexual function, sweating, anything that's interesting. The driver, for want of a better word, is basically vagal tone. So if you're going to improve one metric, that's the one you should focus on. Because if you improve that, everything downstream of it will improve. And it's no great secret in some ways what improves it. And by improving it, we become our compassion, our empathy, our ability to be helpful members of a community also improve. So we feel happier, more fulfilled. We feel like we have a greater sense of purpose and mission. And meaning in life, and that becomes infectious, and the people around us feel that as well, and their vagal tone improves. It's there is this kind of resonant synchrony that goes on. That's why we love being around certain people.
Right. Yeah, there's something to say for that neurophysiologically as well, as far as like what we resonate off of us. So I love it. Claim to fame is one of my favorite sections, getting to know like your product and what you're claiming a lot. I love my favorite section is the lab section. So I'd love to, especially with your clinical background, I'd love to dive into our lab section and talk about some of the research and evidence that you have behind your products and the claims you're making and different things like that, especially someone with your background. I think this could be a fun conversation. So what research do you guys have around this kind of stuff? Like especially the core claim you're making, it seems, is increasing vagal tone. So what research or evidence or background do you have? What was your initial hypothesis? Like how do you test that? Things like that.
Yeah. So, the hypothesis is essentially that sound has a sound across full spectrum from audible sound and subaudible sound has a deep impact on affecting the internal body senses in particular. And therefore increasing the sense of well-being. When I had the notion for Sensate and invented it and patented it, I was clear right from the get-go, really, that I wanted it to be a device that was available to normal people. Because in some ways, the advice and the more obvious path at that point was to make it into a medical device. So an FDA-approved device that was used in hospitals and prescribed by doctors. And I was clear that I didn't want that to be where we went. Partly because I've seen a few technologies, really promising technologies, disappear. Because changing prescribing behavior amongst clinicians is really hard. We all have our things that we do, and you come along with something new and you say use this instead, and it's really hard to get people to change behavior. But also the amount of time and money involved in going through an FDA process is millions of pounds, millions of dollars. Yeah. And many years. And we had something, so I stealth tested a Sensate on patients, real people with real problems in the clinic for a couple of years. Because I needed to know that it really did what it said on the box, that it did have the kind of impact that I thought it would have, and actually exceeded our expectations. So originally we thought we'd have to use 20-minute sessions with people. We established that we could use 10-minute sessions and actually have the same kind of impact and outcome. So we haven't done large-scale double-blind placebo-controlled trials, and we probably won't unless and when we go for FDA status.
Got it.
Which is probably then a requirement of. We have done a number of small trials using MRI, using brain scan and MRI measurements, using heart rate variability measurements, heart rate measurements, breathing assessments, and we found, as well as qualitative questionnaires that people fill in. So what we've seen consistently in our studies is what we see from our users. So I think our users ran something like 245 million minutes last year of Sensate time. So there's a lot of user experience out there. And Anna Goodmanson, my amazing co-founder and CEO, tells me, she's got a tech CEO background. She tells me the kind of responses we get from users is completely unheard of. The kind of level of loyalty and longevity of use. People tend to use a new technology for a few weeks or a few months. We've got people that have been using Sensate for literally years. And people simply don't do that unless they feel different as a result. And obviously we get people to tell us, so what is it you're feeling? In what ways do you feel better? How's your anxiety? How's your sleep? How's your feeling of stress? And we see those consistently reduced very significantly at rates with which a drug would be thrilled. And compared to other technologies and other intervention, considering particularly that Sensate has no side effects, it is sound at the end of the day. So we've never seen anything remotely like a serious side effect, from the use of a session. So it's incredibly safe, and yet it seems to be incredibly effective in a 10-minute session. And we verified that, as I say, against our own small studies. By small, I mean, between 10 and 50 people, done both internally, but also done independent labs. One of them was done at Goldsmiths University, measuring brainwaves, measuring what somebody reports, measuring things like heart rate variability, and measuring somebody's sleep quality. So one study we did last year showed that on average, after 14 days of use, people were sleeping an hour longer per night and falling asleep in half the time. Now, I can tell you, if you know anything about sleep studies, that is utterly unheard of. You get people reporting outcomes of sleep studies, and you get 11 minutes is like a really impressive extra amount of sleep for somebody to get from doing something. We were getting on average an hour a night, which is incredible. That's life-changing.
Yeah, that is interesting. For something that sits on your chest and you listen to a soundscape, I'm guessing that's not through the entire night. I guess there's a gap in my brain on like the causation there. It could have been like Sensate, but if the entrance into sleep would make a lot of sense because it helps bring down your sympathetic and helps you move into like a sleeping mode. But claiming the hour is directly related to Sensate specifically, help me understand that gap.
Yeah, well, as you know, in research, the results are based on how many interventions. So if somebody's doing 5 new things, then of course you don't know what's causing the impact. When in our studies, we just get them to use Sensate. So that's the only change. We don't actually, particularly market. We never claimed to be a sleep device in many ways, but it's one of the main things that people started saying to us was, "Oh yeah, I feel relaxed and great, but actually I'm sleeping so much better." And what we're finding is that people tend to use it before going to bed, not so much, during the night. It's not really designed for that, although we are working, and maybe we'll talk about this a tiny bit later, we're working on a sleep technology. A lot of people go to bed with their mind full. Yeah, yep. So it takes them a while to go to sleep, and then they wake up and they're thinking about that email they didn't send or whatever. So what it seems to do and tends to do is alleviate a lot of that anxiety that's built up during the day. Just enables their nervous system to down-regulate, and they don't wake up feeling groggy like you might from some interventions, say sleeping pills in particular. You may get more sleep, but the quality of the sleep's not so great, and you will tend to wake up feeling groggy. People just slept an hour longer when they were using the Sensate compared to when they weren't. So it was a direct comparison. Just tended to sleep longer and feel better the next day.
And these were self-reported?
The amount of time that they were sleeping for was self-reported based on measurement with an app. But it was comparing before and after data using the same comparisons.
And was there because I saw there was a study that I saw on your guys' website or whatever. I'm not sure which. It might have been the sleep one, but it didn't seem like there was really a good control group necessarily, which, as I'm sure you would know, would make it hard to control for the placebo effect.
Yeah, well, placebo effect is an interesting concept.
I agree. I'm not against the placebo effect, to be clear.
Researchers hate variables, confounding variables, and they hate the placebo effect. An interesting thing, it's getting really hard to get a new drug approved because obviously for a drug to be approved, it has to perform better than placebo. And It's really hard to get a new drug to perform better than placebo. It's interesting to wonder why, but it's getting harder and harder and harder to get a drug to outperform placebo. So for me, everything is placebo. Yeah. And placebo is just simply a term that drug companies in particular, and to some extent researchers, use by something that's really annoying. Think of it this way. If half of all medical effects were down to what we call placebo, and you say, okay, great, but now let's ignore all of that. That is insane, right?
Right.
So it's not
there's something there. There's some really good books on the placebo effect, and
there are. And placebo works. Ted Kapchuk at Harvard. He's at Harvard. Ted Kapchuk, who's been studying placebo for a long time, has now got some really good research showing that placebo works even when you tell the person it's placebo. So you can tell somebody this is placebo, but people tend to find it works, and they'll take it and they feel better, and they'll come back and they say, I don't care what's in that pill or not in it. It works. I feel better. Can I have some more, please?
Yeah, no, there's a book by Dr. Amir Raz called The Suggestible Brain. And he's actually a magician that is also a clinical psychiatrist. Yeah. And he talks about the insane effects that placebo effects can have. And he sets up these elaborate research studies where he'll bring people in who have certain, like eczema or skin issues, which you're like, what does that have to do with the mind? That's a whole separate thing. But where he puts them in these fake machines that are like retired MRI machines that make a bunch of noise but don't actually shoot any of the magnetic resonance at anybody. And people's expectation and the suggestibility of their brain is so powerful that it heals. They get better in some of these things. So
listen, your body has the world's most efficient drug producing laboratories right inside it.
Yes.
There's inflammatory responses. I mean, the processes of self-regulation, homeostasis that your body is doing every second, the chemicals it's producing, the pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory substances, all the stuff it's doing second by second is so complicated and so sophisticated that we can't even begin really to understand it. You know better than I do that we don't really know what's going on in the brain. We have some theories, but we don't really know. And we certainly don't know where consciousness resides. Again, there are theories and some big arguments about, what is consciousness and where does it reside, but we don't, they're. So, given that I've already said that I think how people feel is probably the most important factor in medicine, something which makes them feel better will make them feel better. So, of course, control groups become incredibly important in large, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. But that's if you're trying to patent a new drug, because you have to show that it performs better than placebo. I'm interested in the mechanical, neurological, anatomical effects of infrasound and sound in general and how it works, and we have interested in that. Predominantly, if I'm completely honest with you, I'm mostly interested in people feeling better.
Mm-hmm. Right. I feel that. Being able to our subjective reality is such an interesting perspective, especially when it comes into, because you run a company as well that makes claims to sell product as well. And so using subjective perspectives is tough. How do you balance that with marketing and sales and the obvious outcome that you want for people to purchase your product? Like, if you didn't want people to buy it, why is it not free? So there is some reason to.
Sure.
Like, how do you balance that?
Well, I think normal people, also just want to feel better. I think researchers and scientists want to see data because, of course, they have the scientific model to satisfy. So, if you're publishing something in a peer-reviewed journal, you have to go through certain criteria. And if you're a medical device, you have to do that. We're more focused, and we are doing that, and we will do that, and we're committed to that, and we're committed to examining the mechanisms by which the process works. But I'm also aware of the double standard involved. So, for instance, within science, there's a number of issues which undermine the basis of data collection as being a useful way to manage outcomes. So there's the reproduction crisis, the reproducibility crisis. So the whole basis of the scientific method of evidence-based medicine is you do a trial, you write up the paper, you can give it to somebody else, and they should be able to repeat that trial and get exactly the same results. Now, by a researcher's own admission, between 60 and 70% of medical trials are unreproducible, meaning that they basically are totally irrelevant. Because if you can't reproduce it, you have no idea what caused that outcome. Also, evidence-based medicine in itself, if I asked you what percentage of mainstream treatments do you think are evidence-based of being of proven benefit, what number might you get?
Like 5 to 10% maybe.
Well, okay, so you're much closer. Most people like to think it's like 90% or something. It's about 15%. So about 18% of conventional medical treatments are of proven benefit. And then the rest of them are of maybe good, may not be, we're not so sure. Some we really don't know, and some are directly harmful. But again, there are other issues as well. The Hawthorne effect, where people change their behavior when observed.
Yeah.
So, when you're trying, and also, we're not in a lab. We don't live in a lab. So the idea of trying to remove all variables and say, yeah, great, that's the result, is kind of odd, right? Because then you can't take that result back to your everyday life, because you have children and you have family and you've got a career and you've got your health issues and you need this amount of sleep and you've got to eat this amount of food. So there are so many variables in our lives that the idea that a piece of research where, and of course it's impossible to actually remove every variable, but where an attempt has been made to remove all variables tells you reality and truth is a very interesting idea. And just final point really is that medicine also lags a few decades behind scientific discovery. So what we're saying and doing is actually highly aligned with where theoretical physics is. Nothing that we say or do is weird to a theoretical physicist, whereas it's a little bit challenging for the average researcher, because they're 2 or 3 decades behind where physics is. So the idea that sound and well-being and how something feels is critical to how it responds in a situation, none of that's weird to a physicist. So, and I've seen this over my career. I've seen ideas that were controversial that I was talking about 30 years ago are now mainstream. And you'll find, the New Scientist or the British Medical Association or whatever talking about them as being accepted fact, whereas not that long ago, way after the Roman Empire, they were regarded as heretical concepts because they weren't the current knowledge at the time. So medicine, there's a big lag in medicine. And as we say in any ology, any profession, it advances one death at a time. Somebody somewhere has to die, and their cherished theories and research and reputation has to be before they can really be challenged. So, which is why
the opposite is also true of this. Is something I'd be curious to get the opposite's true. That the person who did leaching back in the day, they're like, well, a physicist or a physician would understand the leaching. They would understand why I'm sucking blood out of someone makes sense. Like, so how do you know that you're not that person? Or how do you check yourself in relation to, like, you're so certain that this will be mainstream in a couple of years, but how do you know that? How do you check yourself? I'm curious.
Yeah, no, that's the absolute perfect question. Leaching is a good example because actually bloodletting and leaching came from China, which have been using it for about 5,000 years. And then when the Jesuits brought it to Europe, they thought, well, the Chinese take a drop, so I'm going to take like a pint. That's got to be better, right? So if the person doing the bloodletting or leaching, if half their patients died, then that might be a clue. So, but if most of them said, yeah, I feel great, and I continue to feel great months and years down the line, then that would be what you want to hear. So we try to filter, and also we're not saying anything new. Yeah. So all we're really doing is formatting and providing something which human beings have been doing for 10,000 years, which is finding ways to make their chest resonate. All we're doing is doing it in a consistent, predictable, short way so that you don't have to go up a mountain and spend 10 years at the foot of a master learning how to do it, because most people aren't going to do that. Thank God they're not going to do that. And the simple fact is that we get incredible responses from our users. And, like I say, last year alone, 245 million minutes. People don't do that unless they feel better. And they feel better over a period of time. That's the litmus test, right? Is, okay, great, I feel better. But many things will make you feel better. Fasting, right. Cold bath, calorie restrict. There's lots of things that will make you feel better for a while. And might even alleviate, hypnosis, alleviate your symptoms for a while. How are you in 6 months' time? Are you still better? And if you are, okay, great. Carry on doing what you're doing.
Right. Yeah, it'd be interesting. I would love to see some longer-term, longitudinal type stuff coming out of some of this. I feel like that's an area of research that would be really interesting for you guys, just to be able to make a more causal claim, if you will.
Yeah, and we're committed to that. But as I say, you're talking about tens of millions of dollars.
Right. It's not cheap.
To do that at the level that you're talking about, which we would love to do. And if there's anyone listening who wants to give us, $5 million to do that research, great. But so a small, tech startup doesn't have that kind of resource. And the resources we do have, we choose to spend on things which are of direct benefit to our patients. So We'd like to make the FDA happy, and we'd like to make researchers and academic journals happy, but they're not our users.
Yeah.
Our
No, I
focus
get
is
it.
making our users happy.
Yeah, 100%. I get it. We talk to tons of wellness founders, and this is like the core like fork in the road where a lot of people get is this exact moment. It's because it's not cheap, but it's good that it's something that you're committed to and that you're taking an objective look at. I really like that. I'd love to move into kind of our next frontier section where we get to talk a little bit about the future as well as we start to wrap up a little bit here. What is the future look like to you? Like what is the roadmap for Sensate, and how do you want to affect the future?
Yeah, I mean, we've always seen ourselves as a wellness platform, not just a single technology and a single app. So the app is and can be developed in a whole bunch of ways, and the hardware that synchronizes with the app. There are various. I mean, we've done a number of improvements and iterations, but there are other products which can spin off from that. There are specialist use cases. I mentioned sleep. We get a lot of inquiries from parents saying, "Can I use this with my kids?" There's anxiety and depression, and forgive me for saying this, but hugely sadly, suicide amongst young people is at an all-time high. And there's a lot of very anxious, frightened parents working with kids who are anxious, a lot of who will be on the spectrum, who are really finding it hard to cope with the amount of overwhelming stimulation all around them. So, they're really looking for technology which will help. And it does. Although we say, the age limit is 13, there's people of that age and younger who parents want to use it with. And the ones that have done that, without even asking us, come back to us and say, yeah, it really helps. And I used it on my own kids. My own kids had kind of night terrors. So I just, I experimented on them, as you do. And they, and it was a great benefit to them. So there's the kind of child applications. There's sleep is in a way a symptom. We think we need to sleep more, but the reason we're not sleeping is because of what we're doing in the rest of our lives. So great, if we sleep more, we'll have more energy, and we might be able to change our lives. So I'm very supportive of that. And the absolute epidemic of anxiety and stress, which was there anyway and has obviously turned into a tidal wave since lockdown. The incidence of anxiety globally, particularly in the global north, is just crazy. The way in which it's increased, particularly, as I say, amongst younger people. So there's a massive need there for something which effectively helps people's anxiety, insomnia, and the way they feel. But also what I'm increasingly trying to work with is what I call the what now question. So once, and this is where a lot, being a product which has now been around for a few years and has hundreds of millions of minutes of use, we're finding that some of our users are saying, I'm much more in control of my stress and my anxiety, but I'm wondering what, in terms of the company's message about how to create a better world, what does that mean? How can I use the product to maybe become more proficient at that? So partly in the app, partly in the product itself, partly in the way we write the soundscapes, partly in the online material that will be available, maybe teaching courses, etc. We're creating content and situations, including potentially face-to-face ones, which enable people to start to inquire into and answer some of those questions. So, okay, I'm feeling better. How do I now take this to the next level? How do I, tone my vagus nerve? How do I become a better person? How do I activate my compassion and empathy glands even more so I can become like a beacon of inspiration in the people around me? And one of my personal interests is in eldership. So the idea of leaning into becoming an elder. I think one of the biggest things that's missing in our society and that's causing a lot of the problems is we've basically lost a generation of elders. So, young people are growing up using technology for many of the functions and roles that elders should be providing. And because we've denigrated the role of the elder, there's lots of people who have a lifetime experience who don't feel able to step up as a mentor, as a guide, as a teacher for younger people, for adolescents and younger people. So so in my personal work and my nature work, one of the things I do is kind of eldership training, eldership workshops, just to try and give people, by connecting with nature, trying to give people the confidence to be able to say that, there's a lot, actually, I've got a lifetime of experience here, and there's things that I can show and tell somebody who's younger than me that will help them out of their anxiety and because it's difficult for kids growing up now, kids these days, right? Because they genuinely see a world that they know is going to be different to the ones that they're parents and grandparents experienced, and at the extreme end of that may not even be here when they grow up. How do you not feel anxious about that? It's asking a lot, right? So the wave of anxiety is completely understandable, but also I know with absolute certainty that the only way we change the future is by taking part in it.
Oh, yeah. So that is a sentiment I absolutely agree with. 100%. So sounds like you got some exciting times ahead. I haven't heard the eldership things before, but that's a really interesting concept. I'd love to move into our what we call the lightning lab. Our audience loves this section. The way it kind of works, I explained this before we hopped on here, is I'm going to throw you a couple quick questions, and the goal is to respond either in a word, a sentence, or a story. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. So the first one is a myth that needs to die. So what's the number one health and wellness myth you'd like to bust?
That pain equals gain.
Ooh, pain equals gain. Okay, give us a little bit of a, before we move to the next question, just give us a little bit of a thought on that.
So there's an old Buddhist saying that suffering is inevitable, but pain is optional. So we do have to do hard things, and the neurobiology around the locus coeruleus and the anterior cingulate cortex and all different parts of the brain show that it is necessary to be less comfortable and to do things you don't particularly want to do to gain certain types of gain. But I think we've kind of got a toxic productivity issue, that people think that simply doing more, and this gets interpreted in lifestyle as well as in the workplace, equates to being more productive or better. So the idea that we need to be more productive is, I think, really what I'm saying here. We don't need to be more productive. We need to do more of what we're passionate about and less of what we hate.
One of my co-founders would love you for saying that. Can't wait to tell them about that. All right, next one is darkest industry secret. So you're a health and wellness founder. What's a shady practice in the health and wellness space that nobody's talking about?
Well, it's only real if it's based on experience. So there's a lot of information. The problem with the internet and the great boon of the internet is that all information is there, meaning that we now don't trust any of it. Because how do you verify this diet or that shake or that exercise or this thing when the basis of information has been eroded? At the bottom of the hierarchy of needs is safety. If you don't feel safe, and trust goes hand in hand with safety, then nothing above that feels right. So people don't trust information anymore. They don't trust doctors. They don't trust politicians. So I think the dark secret within wellbeing and healthcare is that a lot of people don't know what they're talking about because it's not based, and it's not that they're a bunch of cowboys, right? It's just that they don't have the actual direct life experience of that thing to be able to convey their message accurately.
Got it. Cool. Okay, last one is, what's one question that you wished more people asked you?
How do I gain purpose and meaning in my life?
Okay, I'm intrigued. In your experience, how do you gain purpose and meaning in your life?
Well, without purpose and meaning, your life is purposeless and meaningless.
Some would argue that life is meaningless, and we create meaning, and that's our purpose, is to create meaning.
Sure. I had a revelation today. I'm not saying it's a good one, but for me it was interesting. I've been trying to define what it means to lead a good life.
Question for the ages.
Certainly one nice soundbite I came into my head today was, on your deathbed, can you look back at your life and think, okay, there are no major I wish I hadn't done that at moments. Because, you work with, you talk to nurses or hospice care workers. Most people, when they're dying, huge regrets. So if you know that in advance, if you know that on your deathbed, you're probably going to regret some of the shit you've done, just don't do it, right? And start thinking, and if you make that your mindset, okay, I've got this choice. If I do this thing, am I going to be able to, in however many years' time, sit on my deathbed and think, okay, I'm okay with that? Or am I going to think, oh God, I wish I hadn't done that? Make that your compass. Make that your yardstick for whether or not you do something. And if you do that, you'll never go wrong.
Do you think more people regret the things they didn't do or regret the things they wish they could have done?
I think people regret the things they did do. Well, because of course, those two things are absolutely linked, right? If you do too much of this, it means you're taking away from that. So by doing less of this thing that actually you probably shouldn't be doing or don't need to be doing, it means you free yourself up to do the things that have meaning and purpose that you could be doing, and that will actually make you happy. And it isn't acquiring stuff.
Interesting. All right, the last two questions in our lightning lab that we like to go into with people are, one is from a previous guest. So we had a previous guest that left you a question. They're also a health and wellness founder. And the question they left for you is, what's the biggest epidemic of our time that needs to be tackled? in your opinion?
Well, I mean, we call it stress, but I think what underlies that is fear and anxiety. Yeah, so I think fear, really. My thing is, I think there are only really two emotions.
Mm-hmm.
There's fear and there's love. And then everything else is a shade of one of those two things. So, and the only way to move away from fear is to move towards love. Yeah, love is empathy, compassion, a community, reciprocity. Fear is depression, anxiety, purposelessness, meaninglessness. So, yeah, move towards love, as John Lennon told us.
Especially someone who's trained in IFS psychotherapy. That's a very self-led concept there. So I'm huge on. I love that.
I'm a big fan of IFS. It's great stuff.
Yeah, I love it. All right, last question is really actually a question that you get to leave. So we ask every guest to leave a question for the next guest. So what would you like to ask our next guest? You don't know who it's going to be, but they're a health and wellness founder similar to you.
Well, I think it would have to be that big question that I'm working with myself is, what is it to lead a good life? What would that look like and what does that mean to lead a good life?
Got it. What is it and what does it mean to live a good life? I like that. Cool. Appreciate it. Well, I'm excited. You'll have to tune into our next one, whoever we interview next, and see what they say.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
I'll try and remember to send that episode to you so you can watch the end of it. So really appreciate you joining the Decision Lab. Is there anywhere you'd like to point people as we wrap up, or a final thought you'd like to leave people with?
Move towards love. And you can only do that by mastering, getting better at managing your own self-regulation. And, I'm thrilled and excited by the fact, by Sensate being a way in which people can do that on a manageable way. The website's getsensate.com. Go and have a look. And contact me if you have any questions and you want to know more.
Heck yeah. Awesome. Well, be sure to put that in the comments below or link it down in the description so people can access that. And really appreciate you hopping on. Please, if you guys have not already, like and subscribe. But otherwise, that's it for this episode of the Decision Lab. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. It's time for the lab results section. So this is where we kind of break down what we really think. This is a newer section. I'm trying to speak more directly to you. Chloe and I would usually do this together, but she's feeling sick today. So one of the biggest things that we'll do in here is give our direct rating. So did they pass the lab test? So they could either pass the test, they need some more testing, or they failed to pass the lab test. This is an interesting one. In my opinion, they're kind of in between pass the lab test and need more testing. As we talked about in the episode with Stefan, he is well aware that they need some more testing and things like that. That being like more objective science, like research and like double-blind placebo, he mentioned it, double-blind studies and things like that for sure. They need more of that. That being said, he was very transparent of when we go to the FDA, we will do that. It's millions of dollars, and he has to balance being a founder and their marketing and product and science and all these things. So I do think that some of the research they have done, some of the pilot research that they have done, I've taken a look at. I do think that it really could use some more, way more participants. If I'm looking here, one of the main researchers only had 25 participants, so that's not a lot. Again, there was not a strong control group, which we talked about in our conversation. Self-reported data, short duration, these things are things that I would like to see expanded upon, and he said that he would expand upon it. And that to me means a lot. If a founder saying, yeah, I understand the gaps, here's what we want to do, that's big. The other reason I think that, or I would suggest that they passed the lab test in this case, is that they have tons and tons and tons of data from their users. We're entering into an era where companies are not just companies. They have data on their users. I wear an Apple Watch, a Whoop. My girlfriend wears an Oura Ring and a Garmin. There's all sorts of devices that are constantly collecting data on us. And so I really do think that is not meaningless. I do think that means something. Is it the science in the traditional sense? No. But I do think, and it's something that we come to a lot in these episodes, is that there's something to that. Is it causative? No. Like, can they say that Sensate caused X, Y, or Z with anecdotal data? No, because they have no idea what else their users were doing. So some of that stuff can be a little bit hard. So I would put them, needs a little bit more testing, but they're not hiding anything. And I really, really recommend that. This is something that I would actually buy. I do have a Sensate. It is something that I would actually buy. I think the pairing of the sound with they don't like the word vibration, as you heard it's sound, right? But it feels kind of like a vibration. I'm big on those types of technologies. I have an Apollo. I wear an Apollo all the time. I've got it on right now. That is a vibration type device that's not what Sensate claims to be or does, but I am interested. I do have a Sensate, so it is something that I would personally purchase, and it is interesting, the soundscapes and how they're pairing the nature with the feeling of it, because that is something I do. You can listen to a forest sounds, but I think we would all agree there's something missing there, and I think that Sensate is getting us closer to maybe what that thing is that's missing. So it is something that I think it is something that I do think would I would buy, and I have. So I'll just be transparent about that. The next question we like to ask is, what's the biggest thing that caught you off guard, or something that something new that I learned? Something surprising from the Sensate episode was when he said that you have to objectively experience something for it to be real. And as you guys know, my background is cognitive behavioral neuroscience. I've studied this a lot and I researched this a lot. Subjective experience, predictive processing in our senses, those types of things are things that I'm really interested in. That was just something that was a surprising thing that in the moment I was kind of like, do I believe that? Do I think that's real? Like, is that a true thing? Like, if it's kind of like the concept of if a tree falls in the forest and you're not there, does it happen? Based on what he said, no, which is kind of interesting. It makes you question, what is objective reality then? Is there objective reality, or is everything subjective? My current line of reasoning is that there is this thing that is objective reality, but I'm open to it. So that was a surprising statement, or a surprising thing that he said in relation to an opinion that he has. So that would probably be the most surprising moment for sure. So, all right. If Chloe was here, we'd have a deeper conversation about this, but that's it. That's a wrap for this episode of the Decision Lab. I hope our lab results session gave you clarity that you need to decide on today's brand, whether it's worth your time and money, or is it total BS. If you love this no BS approach to wellness, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if there's a brand you want us to investigate, drop it in the comments or hit us up on Instagram. We would love to hear from you. See you next time on the Decision Lab. Peace.